Long before the borders of modern Canada were ever drawn, before the flags of empire waved over vast territories, and before the names of kings and conquerors were etched into maps, there was the river, the mighty flowing artery that would come to define a nation. The St. Lawrence River, born from the icy depths of the Great Lakes and stretching eastward toward the Atlantic. It carved its way through valleys, forests, and rugged cliffs, connecting the heart of the continent to the rest of the world for thousands of years. Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Algonquin nations, had called its banks home, thriving along its currents and naming it with words of power and reverence. They fished its waters, hunted in its woodlands, and told stories of the spirits that moved with its tide. The river was life itself, a provider, a protector, and a path to the unknown. When Jacques Cartier first laid European eyes on the river in the summer of 1535, he saw more than a geographic marvel. He saw a gateway. Cartier had been searching for a passage to Asia, a fabled route through the Americas that would lead to riches beyond imagination. But what he found instead was something perhaps more valuable, a sprawling inland highway that gave France a foothold in the New World, sailing past the steep cliffs of what is now Quebec City. Cartier marveled at the size and strength of the river, declaring it the finest entrance to a country that could be found in the world. The St. Lawrence was no ordinary river. It was a strategic prize in the imperial chess game that would unfold over the next 2 centuries as France and England vied for control of North America. They recognized the power of this river not just as a route for trade, but as a lifeline that could carry armies, settlers, and influence deep into the continent. In the early 1700s, the French built Fort Frontenac and Fort Niagara, commanding key points along the river and ensuring that their control extended into the Great Lakes, and beyond the fur trade exploded as coureurs de bois and voyageurs paddled birch-bark canoes loaded with pelts, navigating rapids and portages in a rhythm as ancient as the rocks themselves, yet as commerce. And colonization grew. So too did conflict by the mid-18th century. The river had become a line of tension and fear as English and French forces collided during the 7 Years' War. The fate of North America hung in the balance. And at the heart of it all was the St. Lawrence. In 1759, British General James Wolfe launched a daring campaign to seize Quebec City. Sailing up the river with a fleet of ships and thousands of redcoats, he knew the tides would determine his fate. The currents would either deliver him to victory or carry him to ruin. In a single night under cover of fog, Wolfe and his men scaled the cliffs near the Plains of Abraham, a feat that would have been impossible without intimate knowledge of the river, its tides, and its secret inlets. The battle was brief, brutal, and decisive. Wolfe died on the field, but so too did French commander Montcalm, and by morning the British flag waved over Quebec, signaling a new era for Canada. The river now flowed under English control, but it never lost its identity. It remained the artery through which life pulsed into the interior. In the decades that followed, Loyalists fleeing the American Revolution settled along its banks, creating towns and trading posts that blossomed into cities. Montreal grew as a commercial hub, a bustling port where goods from Europe met furs, grain, and timber from the vast Canadian interior. Steamboats emerged in the 19th century, transforming the river into a highway. Of modern industry, ironclad paddle steamers churned through its waters, ferrying passengers and cargo with a speed and reliability that reshaped the very pace of Canadian life. Canals were dug, locks engineered, all to tame the mighty river and extend its reach ever further, and still through all of this, the St. Lawrence remained a place of awe and wonder. Artists painted it, poets praised it, and travelers spoke of its breathtaking vistas where towering cliffs kissed the sky and islands floated. Like jewels on sapphire waters, it was both a commercial lifeline and a national treasure, carrying the weight of Canada's past, present, and future in its current. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the St. Lawrence River only deepened. Its role in shaping the soul of a growing Canada, the newly formed nation, now sought to assert its identity on the global stage, and no symbol carried more weight than the river that had nourished its heart for generations, while railways stitched. Together, the vastness of the Canadian frontier and telegraph wires crackled with modern connection. It was still the St. Lawrence that bore the burden of trade defense and development. The river was a corridor of ambition, as raw materials from the West lumber, wheat minerals, and pelts made their way to Montreal and then out to the Atlantic, and the waiting ships of Britain, France, and the United States. The water carried more than goods. It carried hope. It carried the story of a young nation, trying to prove its worth through iron steel and endless determination. In the early 1900s, industrial cities like Sorel-Trois-Rivières and Cornwall sprang up along the riverbanks, echoing with the sounds of factories, mills, and shipyards. The laborers who toiled there came from every corner of the world: Irish Italians, French Canadians, Ukrainians, and many more, all drawn by the promise of work and a better life, and each morning they would look out at the wide, calm waters of the St. Lawrence and know they were part of something greater, something eternal during the two world wars. The river took on a new strategic role as merchant convoys and naval vessels traveled its length, ferrying men, ammunition, and machines to Halifax. For transatlantic deployment against the German threat, it was not without peril in World War II. German U-boats slipped silently into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, stalking Canadian vessels and sinking ships in cold surprise attacks. The war had come to Canada's doorstep, and the river bore its scars. Yet it also revealed the resilience of the people who lived along its shores. For every ship lost, another was built. For every tragedy endured, another hero emerged in peace and in war. The St. Lawrence never ceased to carry Canada forward. The mid-20th century brought the most ambitious project the river had ever seen: the St. Lawrence Seaway, a massive joint undertaking between Canada and the United States, designed to open the Great Lakes. To ocean-going vessels, it was more than a feat of engineering. It was a declaration to the world that Canada was open for business, and that the river would serve as its most trusted emissary. Completed in 1959, the Seaway transformed the river, yet again widening, deepening, and regulating its flow through a complex system of locks, dams, and channels. It was a marvel of modern technology and a source of pride for both nations. But it came at a cost. Entire villages were submerged. Farmland was lost, communities uprooted forever as progress demanded sacrifice, and not all were willing witnesses to this transformation. The Indigenous peoples who had lived beside the St. Lawrence for millennia watched as sacred sites were drowned by reservoirs and their ancestral rhythms were disrupted by roaring turbines and concrete walls. Their voices, too often ignored, became echoes in the river wind, reminding Canada that every drop of progress should be weighed against the past. Still, the Seaway delivered what it promised. Freighters now glided from Thunder Bay to the Atlantic, without pause, hauling Canadian grain to Europe and bringing oil and goods to a thirsty inland market. Cities like Toronto, Detroit, and Chicago grew ever more connected to the world beyond, thanks to the silent power of the current. It was during this time that the St. Lawrence also became a sanctuary for those seeking more than commerce. Environmentalists, artists, historians, and everyday citizens turned to the river not just for sustenance but for inspiration. In the Thousand Islands region, where the river narrows and splinters into a maze of wooded isles, mansions, summer cottages, and hidden coves, emerged, each one a testament to the natural beauty that money could not create. Only preserve. In Montreal, the river became a backdrop for culture festivals and renewal as old docks turned into promenades and industrial ruins gave way to green parks and shimmering skyscrapers. People once again flocked to its edge, not just for work, but for life. They walked its banks, fell in love beside it, buried their ancestors near its shores, and baptized their children in its churches, all with the murmur of the current in the background. The St. Lawrence was no longer just a river. It was a memory that flowed, a song that never ended, a pulse that bound together French, English, Indigenous, and immigrant alike in a shared story that was still being written. By the late 20th century, the St. Lawrence River had cemented itself as more than a natural wonder or commercial highway. It was now a symbol, a reflection of Canada's promise and paradox, for with all its power and beauty came responsibility, a growing awareness that the river was not infinite, that its waters could be poisoned, its fish could vanish, and its currents could betray those who forgot to respect them. Pollution became one of the river's greatest threats. Factories along its banks poured chemicals into its flow, and untreated sewage from expanding cities clouded its clarity. What had once been a pristine lifeline began to choke on the byproducts of progress and profit. Environmental groups rose in defense of the river, sounding the alarm and demanding action. Grassroots movements from Montreal to Kingston began organizing cleanups, lobbying for stronger regulations, and educating the public about what was at stake. This was no longer just about preserving fish or beaches. It was about preserving identity. The St. Lawrence was not separate from Canada. It was its bloodstream, and if it ailed, so too would the nation's scientists documented declining fish populations, toxic algae blooms, and rising water temperatures, while elders in Indigenous communities mourned the loss of spawning grounds that had fed their ancestors for generations. The balance had been broken, and healing would take more than legislation. It would require humility and change. In the 1980s and 90s, new policies began to take root: laws to regulate industrial waste initiatives, to protect wetlands, and collaborative efforts between Canada and the United States to monitor the health of the river through shared data and mutual accountability. Slowly, signs of recovery emerged. Birds returned, fish stocks stabilized, and parts of the river once thought irreversibly damaged began to show resilience. But the battle was far from over. Urban sprawl continued to creep toward the bank's threatening habitats, and increasing runoff cargo ships grew in size and frequency, churning the river's depths and risking spills, accidents, and the introduction of invasive species such as zebra mussels, which began clogging pipes and outcompeting native life. These challenges tested the resolve of those who had vowed to protect the river, and it was in this moment of ecological reckoning that a cultural renaissance also bloomed. Artists, writers, and filmmakers began to rediscover the St. Lawrence as both muse and message, exploring its dual nature. As both cradle and crucible of Canadian life novels were written in its voice, songs composed to its rhythm, and documentaries filmed to capture its grandeur. And fragility festivals emerged that celebrated river culture, honoring the traditions of the Mi'kmaq, the Mohawk, and the Métis, who had long seen the river not as a resource, but as a relative. This resurgence was not about nostalgia. It was about truth, reconciling what had been lost with what could still be saved. And across classrooms, libraries, and public forums, the story of the St. Lawrence was retold not as a footnote in the founding of a nation, but as a protagonist, a living witness to every triumph and tragedy that shaped the land, from colonial conquest to constitutional crisis, from fur trade to free trade. The river had seen it all, carried it all, and survived it all. Perhaps that is why it remained a source of fascination for historians who saw in its currents the key to understanding Canada's past and a warning for its future. It was here, after all, that empires rose and fell, that generations risked everything to cross icy waters in search of land, freedom, or survival, and it is here still that communities gather to celebrate, to mourn, and to imagine a future where nature and progress are not enemies, but partners. The St. Lawrence continues to teach those willing to listen that power lies not in dominance, but in balance, not in conquest, but in connection. As the 21st century advanced, the St. Lawrence River entered yet another chapter of its long unfolding story, this time shaped by new global pressures and shifting cultural consciousness climate. Change emerged as the greatest challenge yet. Glaciers feeding the Great Lakes began to retreat, altering water levels that in turn affected the flow and health of the river. Warmer winters disrupted ice cover, allowing for longer shipping seasons, but also threatening the delicate life cycles of native species, from beluga whales in the estuary to the elusive American eel, whose mysterious migration had once inspired legends and reverenced technology, brought new tools, satellites, drones, and Data models all mapped and monitored the river in ways unimagined by Cartier or Champlain, but while these tools offered insight, they also revealed warning signs of accelerating change, erosion, swallowed shoreline. In some regions, storms grew stronger, dredging operations increased, and with every adjustment to the river's flow, questions arose about what was being lost beneath the surface, even as industries adapted and governments pledged carbon reductions. Communities along the river knew they were on the front line of an environmental transformation whose timeline was uncertain and whose costs were already evident, yet within these same communities there was also hope, driven by a deeper integration of indigenous knowledge and Western science, a recognition that the wisdom of those who had lived with the river for millennia could no longer be ignored. In Kanawake Akwesasne and other First Nations communities. Young leaders blended tradition and innovation, restoring native fish habitats, reviving ancient canoe routes, and teaching the next generation that the river was more than water. It was identity. Elders spoke of the spirit of the river, how it carried memory and responsibility, how listening to the current could reveal what textbooks never could. Universities and research centers began collaborating with tribal councils, creating programs that studied the river not just through a scientific lens, but through a cultural and spiritual one. This fusion became a model not only for ecological stewardship, but for reconciliation across Canada. For if the river had once borne the boats of colonizers, it could now carry the voices of those long silenced, and so festivals along the river took on new tones, blending heritage days with climate summits, art shows with policy forums, and history lessons with storytelling circles, where children listened as their elders spoke of the river's moods, seasons, and sacred bends. Tourism also shifted away from luxury cruises and loud motors toward eco-friendly kayaking, bird-watching, and heritage tours. Visitors came not to conquer the river, but to learn from it. They walked quiet trails on Grosse Île, reflecting on the stories of Irish immigrants who died in quarantine during the Great Famine. They stood at Cap de la Madeleine, watching whales breach at sunset, and felt in that moment something ancient and humbling, the sense that this place, this ever-moving body of water, was greater than them and worthy of reverence. At the same time, artists continued to rise, capturing the river's changing face in brushstroke and verse, while engineers explored ways to power cities using its flow without destroying its soul. Wind, solar, and hydro converged in green corridors meant to balance demand with preservation, yet tensions remained between development and conservation. Between economic ambition and ecological truth, the Seaway still brought in billions each year, yet its aging locks and canals needed repair. Its use of freshwater raised concerns, and its carbon footprint remained a point of debate, and all the while, the river flowed silent and vast, carrying ships past old battlegrounds and modern cities, past forgotten forts and new high-rises, past communities rebuilt after floods and towns still grieving lost shores. The St. Lawrence had outlived empires, endured wars, and watched as flags changed hands, but it had never ceased to give to those willing to respect it. Perhaps that is why it continues to inspire, not with thunder or spectacle, but with steady presence, a kind of quiet strength that runs deeper than steel, deeper than stone, deeper, even than history itself, for as long as it flows. So too does the story of Canada, not in straight lines, but in currents shaped by time, memory, and the unbreakable bond between land and water. In the present day, the St. Lawrence River stands not only as a geographical marvel, but as a living monument to resilience, transformation, and unity. Its waters still thunder down from Lake Ontario, past the narrow channels of the Thousand Islands, past the pulsing heart of Montreal, past the cliffs of Quebec City, and finally out to the Atlantic Ocean, carrying with them the weight of centuries and the promise of tomorrow for the people who live along its banks, whether in bustling cities or quiet fishing villages. The river is more than a backdrop. It is a companion, a constant thread in the fabric of daily life. Ferries glide across its surface, carrying workers and tourists. Cargo ships announce their passage with deep horns as they navigate locks and bridges. Fishers cast their lines with the same hope as their ancestors and children dip their feet into its chill. Each summer, forging memories on the same stones worn smooth by generations, the river connects, and it also divides, not just in geography, but in experience. For every prosperous port, there are communities struggling to balance tradition with modernity, to preserve culture in a world driven by speed and consumption. And yet the river offers a kind of clarity, reminding those who pause to observe that time moves with purpose, not haste. It reminds them that healing, whether environmental, cultural, or personal, takes seasons, not seconds. The St. Lawrence has been a battlefield, a trade route, a burial ground, a boundary, and a bridge. It has seen explorers, empires, revolution, war, prosperity, pollution, and renewal. It has shaped identity and economy, landscape and language. It is the reason Montreal exists, the reason Quebec was fortified, the reason Ontario reached out to the sea. It has carried timber fir grain immigrants, ideas, and hope, and now it carries something more, the burden and blessing of being remembered not as a tool, but as a teacher in classrooms across Canada. Students trace its course on maps, not just to memorize locations, but to understand connections in literature. It appears as a symbol of endurance in science, as a case study in balance in politics, as a test of cooperation, and in hearts, as a source of quiet pride. Because to understand Canada, one must understand the St. Lawrence River, its flow, its history, and its soul. It teaches that greatness is not built on force but on flow, that survival depends not on conquest but on coexistence, that the future is written not in the speed of currents, but in their direction. So as another generation grows up beside its waters, as new challenges rise and new dreams take shape, the river remains steady, a guide, a witness, a lifeline, ever moving, ever present, ever Canadian. And so the St. Lawrence River continues its journey not only through the land but through the spirit of a nation uniting past and present memory and ambition, the known and the unknown in the endless rhythm of its flow.